Clara Bennett counted the last bills in her envelope one more time because she needed the number to be different than it had been the 3 times before. It was not. $47. Her rent was due in 9 days. Her daughter Lily needed new shoes because the soles of the pink sneakers had separated from the canvas 2 weeks ago, and Clara had fixed them with super glue and a prayer that neither had held. The electricity bill was a week past due, and the letter on the kitchen counter had the kind of bold red lettering that meant the next envelope would come with a shut-off date printed inside it. She folded the bills back into the envelope and pressed her palms against the countertop until her arms stopped shaking. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The kitchen was small and clean in the way poverty taught women to keep things clean. Nothing decorative, nothing extra, everything in its place, because when you own very little, you learn to treat what you had like it mattered. The linoleum was curling at the corners near the refrigerator, and the faucet dripped in a rhythm she no longer noticed until nights like this one, when she couldn't sleep. Outside the window, the gray pre-dawn light of Millbrook County was just beginning to rise above the pines, and Clara could hear the distant rumble of a truck somewhere on the county highway, probably the first of the logging crews heading out. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. 34 years old, single mother, high school diploma, and a year of community college that had ended when she got pregnant with Lily, and the boy she thought she loved decided loving her was more complicated than he had signed up for. He had left a note on the table of their apartment saying he was not ready. He had taken his toothbrush and his guitar, and Clara had not heard from him since, though sometimes late at night she wondered if he ever thought about the daughter he had never met, the girl with his exact eyes and none of his doubts. The laptop sat open on the kitchen table, its screen dim from low battery. Clara walked over, plugged it in with the charger whose cord was wrapped in electrical tape in 3 places, and sat down on the plastic chair that had been $1 at a yard sale the summer before. She was searching for jobs again, the same search she had been running for 4 months now. Waitress in Millbrook was saturated. The diner had 3 waitresses already, and none of them were quitting. The truck stop wanted someone with experience. The hotel in Brennerville, 40 minutes away, required reliable transportation, and Clara's truck had a transmission that slipped into neutral on steep inclines and made a sound like breaking bones when she started it cold. She had applied anyway. They had not called back. Nobody called back anymore. Nobody had since the warehouse closed in February, and 300 people in the county had lost their jobs on the same Tuesday morning, and Clara had been one of them, and ever since then the whole region had felt like it was being slowly drained of whatever blood kept small towns alive. She refreshed her email. Nothing new except a promotional message from a grocery store offering coupons she would not use because the store was 40 miles away. She opened the local classified site, the one run by a retired schoolteacher who updated it maybe twice a week, and scrolled through the usual listings. Used lawnmower, baby stroller, firewood, seasoned, a pickup truck for $1,200, a rocking chair that had belonged to somebody's grandmother. Her eyes kept moving down the page on habit, not hope, because habit was cheaper than hope and required less of her. Then her scrolling stopped. The listing was 3 lines long. Abandoned 1960s farmhouse. Property back taxes owed. Minimum bid $10. 32 acres. Sold as is. Contact county treasurer. She stared at the screen for a long time. $10. That was not a price. That was a dare. That was the county saying, please, for the love of God, someone take this thing off our hands. She clicked the listing and read the details. The property had belonged to a woman named Margaret Holloway, deceased, no known heirs, tax lien in effect since 2019. The house was described as being in severe disrepair, and the county did not guarantee the condition of any structures on the property. Showings were by appointment only, and interested parties were asked to contact the treasurer's office during business hours. The address was 4471 Old Mill Creek Road. Clara knew that road. It was one of the county roads that wound up into the foothills, past the old dairy farms that had all closed years ago, past the washout where the bridge had been replaced twice, past the turn where her mother used to take her to pick blackberries when she was small. She sat there in the dim light of the kitchen with her breath caught in her throat. $10. She had $47 in an envelope and a daughter sleeping in the next room who deserved a home and not a rented trailer where the landlord raised the rent every spring without fixing the mold that bloomed under the bathroom sink. She closed the laptop and walked to the bedroom door and pushed it open gently. Lily was curled up under a quilt that Clara's mother had made before she died. Her dark hair spread across the pillow, her small hand tucked under her cheek. She was 7 years old and had never once had a room she did not have to share with her mother, had never once had a yard, had never once picked a tomato from a garden that belonged to her family. Clara watched her breathe and thought about what $10 could buy. The decision did not feel like a decision. It felt like a door opening that she had not known was there. By 7 o'clock, Clara had called her neighbor Mrs. Pettigrew, a retired postal worker in her 60s who watched Lily sometimes for a plate of cookies or a bag of produce from the community food bank, and arranged for Lily to stay with her after school. By 8:30, Clara had driven the 12 miles to the county seat of Millbrook proper, her truck wheezing but holding together, and parked in front of the low brick building where the treasurer kept his office. The sign on the door said walk-ins welcome between 9 and 4, and she sat in her truck with her hands wrapped around the steering wheel and tried to rehearse what she was going to say. She had not bought a house before. She had never bought anything larger than a used microwave, and that had been from a man who met her in a gas station parking lot. She did not know the protocol. She did not know the forms. She did not know if they would laugh at her, a woman in jeans with a tear in one knee and a jacket from Goodwill that was 2 sizes too large, trying to hand over $10 in exchange for a piece of land. The treasurer was a man named Hal Osterman, in his late 50s, with a kind face and glasses that had slid halfway down his nose. He was eating a donut at his desk when Clara came in, and he set it down on a napkin and gestured to the chair across from him with a smile that was probably the same smile he gave everyone. Clara sat down and told him she was interested in the property on Old Mill Creek Road, and Hal Osterman's expression shifted in a way she could not quite read. He asked her if she had seen the property. She said no, not recently, not since she was a child, but she knew the road. He asked her if she was aware of its condition. She said she understood it was in severe disrepair. He asked her if she had any contractor experience, or experience with old houses, or any kind of construction background at all. She said no. She said she worked retail and food service, and she had worked at the warehouse before it closed, and she knew how to use basic tools because her father had taught her before he passed away when she was 14. Hal Osterman leaned back in his chair and took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes and put them back on. Then he said something Clara would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "Ma'am, I am going to be honest with you because I do not want you walking into something you cannot walk out of. That house has been empty for 6 years. The last time anyone went inside it was when the county sent an assessor in 2020, and he said the place was not safe to enter without hard-toe boots. The roof has holes in it. The back porch has collapsed. There is a tree grown through the kitchen window. Whatever is inside has been there a long time, and whatever wildlife has moved in has made itself at home. The woman who owned it died alone, and nobody cleaned it out, because there was nobody to clean it out." He paused, and then he said, "But for $10, it is 32 acres. And if you have the stomach to deal with what is waiting for you inside, it is yours. Would you like to see it today?" Clara said yes. The drive out to Old Mill Creek Road was longer than she remembered. Hal followed her in his own car, a practical silver sedan, and they wound up through the hills until the paved road ended and the gravel began. And then the gravel road narrowed into a single dirt track that pushed through stands of pine and oak and past fields that had gone back to brush and blackberry canes. The mailbox for 4471 was leaning at an angle against its own post, the name Holloway barely visible under years of weather. And when Clara turned her truck into the long driveway, her stomach tightened. The driveway was 2 ruts through grass that had grown knee-high, and she felt the undercarriage of her truck scrape against something hard more than once. Then the trees opened, and Clara saw the farmhouse for the first time. It was worse than she had let herself imagine, and it was more beautiful than she had expected. Those two feelings arrived in the same breath. The house was a 2-story rectangle of clapboard siding that had once been white and was now the color of rain. The roof had 3 visible patches of tar paper and one corner that had given way entirely to rot, showing the rafters beneath like ribs. The front porch leaned noticeably to one side. Every window on the first floor was either broken, boarded up, or so thick with grime they looked like sheets of old pewter. A maple tree had grown up right against the north wall, its branches actually touching the siding, and on the east side an oak had come down at some point years ago and was still lying there, half rotted, its roots torn up from the ground in a circular wall of earth and stone. But the bones of the house were visible under the wreckage. It had been built with care once, by someone who had thought about the way the roofline came down over the windows, the way the porch wrapped slightly around the corner, the placement of it on a rise with the sun rising over the back and setting over the front. Somebody had once loved this place. Hal got out of his car and stood beside her and did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "The land is good. 32 acres. Most of it wooded, but there is a clearing out back that was once a vegetable garden and a small pasture, and the spring on the south end has never run dry even in the worst summers. The well is still there, though I cannot tell you if it works. There is no public water out here and no public sewer. Septic tank is somewhere on the property, and the county has no record of when it was last pumped. The nearest utility pole is a quarter-mile back up the road, and the electric line to the house has been down since 2021. You would need to get that restored before you could move in." He kept going, listing problems the way a doctor lists symptoms, and Clara listened, but she did not really hear him, because she was looking at the house. She walked up to the porch and put her hand on one of the posts that held up the porch roof. The paint flaked off in her palm, and underneath, the wood was dark and solid. Not rotten, just old. She looked up at the porch ceiling, and through the holes in the boards, she could see the floor of the upstairs landing, and she could see a piece of curtain still hanging in one of the upstairs windows, moving slightly in a draft. A curtain. Someone had hung it. Someone had chosen that fabric. Someone had looked out through it once and thought about their day. She felt something in her chest that was not quite sadness and not quite hope, but some third thing that lived between them. Hal was saying something about the deed. Clara turned to him and asked if she could go inside. Hal hesitated. He said he would not recommend it without proper equipment, but if she insisted, she could look around the first floor. He had a flashlight in his car. He went back to get it, and Clara stood alone on the porch and felt the boards shift under her weight and did not move. When Hal returned, he handed her the flashlight and stood back. He said he would wait outside. He said if she heard anything move, to come back out immediately. She nodded and pushed the front door open. The smell hit her first. Not rot. Exactly, though there was rot in it. Mostly it was dust. Deep, powdery, accumulated dust of a decade, mixed with the scent of old wood and old paper and the faint earthy smell of mice having lived and died and decomposed in various places. She covered her nose with the sleeve of her jacket and clicked on the flashlight and stepped inside. The front room had been a parlor once. There was a faded sofa against one wall, the upholstery split open at the seams with stuffing spilling out. A wooden rocking chair sat near a fireplace that was full of old ash and bird droppings. A braided rug lay on the floor, stained and chewed at the edges. On the mantel, a row of small ceramic birds sat under an inch of dust. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its glass face cracked, its pendulum still. On the wall above the sofa hung a framed photograph of a young couple on their wedding day, probably from the 1940s, and the young woman in the photograph had a face Clara could not quite look away from. It was a kind face, a face that knew things. Margaret Holloway, Clara thought, or her mother, somebody who had stood right where Clara was standing and had been young and in love. Clara moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was through a doorway to the right, and it was the room Hal had warned her about. The window over the sink had been broken for so long that a branch from the maple tree had come through it and grown into the room, its leaves still green in the summer light. The counter under the window was covered in lichen. The sink was full of mouse droppings and dry leaves. The old stove was coated in an inch of dust and something that looked like the remains of a nest. The refrigerator door hung open, empty and dark. On the kitchen table, a cup and saucer sat as if someone had just finished their tea and walked out of the room and never come back. Clara thought Margaret Holloway had probably been someone who drank her tea every afternoon. She thought Margaret Holloway had probably been sitting at that table the day she became too sick to come back to it. There was a narrow staircase to the second floor, and Clara did not go up. Hal had said the floor up there was questionable, and she believed him. Instead, she walked back through the parlor and into the dining room on the other side. The dining room had a long wooden table and 6 chairs, and a sideboard against the far wall, and a china cabinet with most of its glass intact. Inside the cabinet, a dinner set sat on dusty shelves, white porcelain with a faded pattern of blue flowers around the rim. Clara opened the cabinet door and lifted one of the plates. The pattern was cornflowers. Her grandmother had owned the same pattern, though not nearly a complete set. She set the plate back carefully. She turned and saw the wall. The dining room had one wall that was different from the others. Where 3 walls were covered in the same faded floral wallpaper, this 4th wall was paneled in wood, dark stained planks running vertically from floor to ceiling. It was not unusual for a farmhouse of that era to have one wall of wood paneling, especially a room that had once been used for company. But something about this wall made Clara stop and look at it longer than she had looked at anything else. She took a step closer. She ran the flashlight beam along the seams of the boards. The spacing was even, uniform, careful. The workmanship was better than anywhere else in the house. Whoever had put up this paneling had taken pains that the rest of the house did not reflect. And then her flashlight beam caught something else. On one of the boards, about chest high, there was a small round indentation, no bigger than the tip of her little finger. At first she thought it was a knot in the wood, but when she leaned closer, she could see it was not a knot. It was a perfect circle, drilled into the wood at a precise depth, and inside the hole was a tiny brass fitting, so dark with age that it was almost the same color as the wood around it. She stared at it. She did not understand what she was looking at, but she understood that she was looking at something deliberate. Someone had done that on purpose, and someone had wanted it not to be noticed. She stepped back and looked at the wall as a whole, and now that she was looking, she could see that the wall was not quite flush with the ceiling. There was a hair-thin gap at the top, a thin dark line where the paneling met the plaster, and the line was not uniform. It was shaped like a rectangle, about 6 feet wide, as if something had been framed into the wall and then covered over. Clara's breath came shallow. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the wood. It was solid. It gave nothing. But she was suddenly certain, in the way a person sometimes becomes certain of things they have no proof of, that behind this wall there was something. Hal called her name from outside. He was asking if she was all right. Clara heard her own voice answer that she was fine, that she was coming out, and she stepped away from the wall with her heart beating louder than it had beaten in months. She walked out of the house back into the sunlight, and she stood on the porch, and she could not tell Hal what she had seen, because she did not know what she had seen. She could not say, there is a wall inside that has a little brass hole in it that should not be there. She could not say, I think there is a hidden room in that house. Because she might be wrong, and even if she was right, Hal would want to know why, and she could not explain why, and she did not want him to know. She wanted the house. She wanted it badly enough that she was not going to say anything that might cause him to raise the price, or change his mind, or call on somebody else to look. She wanted the house now more than she had wanted it an hour ago, and she had wanted it plenty then. She said, Mr. Osterman, I will take it. I have the $10 on me right now. Hal looked at her with the long, careful look of a man who had been trying to gently discourage her and realized he had failed. He said she should take some time. She should think about it. She should maybe bring a contractor out to assess the roof and the foundation and the septic. She should understand that the paperwork would transfer the property and all its problems to her, and the problems were many and serious. Clara listened to him patiently, and then she said again, Mr. Osterman, I want this property. I have made up my mind, and I do not have money to pay a contractor for an assessment. But I have $10, and I have time, and I have reasons of my own. Please let me do this. Hal looked at her for another long moment, and then he nodded, slowly, and he said all right. He said she should come back to his office in an hour, and they would do the paperwork. He said he would waive the inspection contingency, because she was waiving it herself. He said the property would be hers by the end of the afternoon, with all tax obligations current through the year because of a state program for abandoned properties that forgave back taxes to the first qualifying buyer. Clara had not known that. She almost laughed. She also almost cried. Instead, she shook his hand and got back in her truck. Before they went back to the office, Hal walked with her once more around the outside of the house. He showed her the old well on the south side, its stone ring half buried in weeds, and the collapsed chicken coop behind it, and the rusted skeleton of what might have once been a tractor partly swallowed by vines. He showed her the clearing he had mentioned, a flat space about an acre wide where the garden had been, now grown into tall grass with a few fruit trees still bearing witness to someone's long-ago labor. A gnarled apple tree, a pear that had split in a storm and kept growing on what remained of its trunk. and down a path that had mostly disappeared into the woods. There was a small spring that bubbled up from a mossy rock face into a pool about the size of a bathtub. The water was cold and clear. Clara knelt down and dipped her fingers into it, and she thought about Margaret Holloway kneeling in the same place 60 years ago, and she thought about Lily drinking water from this spring in some future Clara could not yet imagine. Hal said the spring had always run, even in the drought years. It was one of the reasons Margaret had never sold. It was also, he said, one of the reasons nobody had bought the property at any of the previous tax sales. The well water required testing. The spring was unregulated. Nobody wanted to move out this far. On the drive back to Millbrook, Clara stopped at the one gas station along the way and bought a cup of coffee with the change in the bottom of her cup holder. And while she was paying, the girl behind the counter, a girl Clara had gone to high school with but had not spoken to in years, recognized her and asked what she was doing way out here. Clara said she had been looking at a property. The girl, whose name was Tanya, asked which property. Clara told her. Tanya made a face. "Honey," she said, "that is the Holloway place. Everybody knows that place is haunted. Plus it is falling down. My daddy says the roof is going to cave in by next winter. You are not actually buying that, are you?" Clara smiled thinly and said she was. Tanya laughed. She actually laughed, the short, sharp laugh of a person who had been told something so absurd it made her day better. She said, "With what money, Clara?" Clara took her coffee and walked out of the gas station without answering. The paperwork took 40 minutes. Clara signed her name on a dozen forms. She handed over a $10 bill from her envelope. Hal gave her a receipt and an old brass key on a faded red ribbon and a set of documents that named her, Clara Jean Bennett, as the sole owner of record for 4471 Old Mill Creek Road and the 32 acres attached to it. He said the deed would be officially recorded in 3 to 5 business days. He said she should not move in until the electricity was restored, which would require a licensed electrician to inspect the lines and panels. He said he was required by law to tell her one more time that the structure was not habitable in its current condition. Clara said she understood. She thanked him. She walked out of the office with the key in her hand and sat in her truck and cried for about 90 seconds and then wiped her face and drove home. She told Lily that night, after dinner, after she had picked her up from Mrs. Pettigrew's and made them both scrambled eggs with toast, because there had not been anything in the refrigerator that amounted to a real meal. She sat Lily down on the couch and she held the brass key in her palm and she said, "Honey, I did something today. I bought us a house." Lily's eyes went wide. A house. A real house. Like with rooms? Clara laughed despite herself. Yes, with rooms. With a yard. 32 acres of yard, actually. It is not a pretty house right now. It is very, very broken. It is going to take a long time to fix. But it is ours, Lily. No landlord. No rent. Ours. And we are going to work on it together, and someday, it is going to be a real home. Lily stared at her mother, and then she threw her arms around Clara's neck and held on tight. And Clara closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of her daughter's hair and thought, this is what it was for. This is why I did not give up on the things I did not give up on. She did not tell Lily about the wall. She told Lily that night, after dinner, after she had picked her up from Mrs. Pettigrew's and made them both scrambled eggs with toast, because there had not been anything in the refrigerator that amounted to a real meal. She sat Lily down on the couch and she held the brass key in her palm and she said, "Honey, I did something today. I bought us a house." Lily's eyes went wide. A house. A real house. Like with rooms? Clara laughed despite herself. Yes, with rooms. With a yard. 32 acres of yard, actually. It is not a pretty house right now. It is very, very broken. It is going to take a long time to fix. But it is ours, Lily. No landlord. No rent. Ours. And we are going to work on it together, and someday, it is going to be a real home. Lily stared at her mother, and then she threw her arms around Clara's neck and held on tight. And Clara closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of her daughter's hair and thought, this is what it was for. This is why I did not give up on the things I did not give up on. She did not tell Lily about the wall. Later, after Lily was asleep, Clara sat on the steps outside her trailer and watched the moths beat themselves senseless against the yellow bulb over the door. The man in the trailer next to hers, an unemployed roofer named Doyle who drank too much and talked too loud, came stumbling back from wherever he had been and saw her sitting there and laughed. "Clara Bennett," he said, the famous property owner. I heard the news. He let out a hooting laugh and almost tripped on his own feet. $10 mansion, he said. Hope you saved some pennies for the bulldozer. A woman across the lot, Mrs. Corbin, who ran an unofficial daycare and was the first to know everyone's business, poked her head out of her door and said, Clara, honey, I do not mean to be ugly, but that place is going to eat you alive. You should have used that $10 for groceries. Clara said, Mrs. Corbin, I did. And then she went inside and shut the door and did not look at anyone else for the rest of the night. She could hear Doyle still laughing out there for a while. She could hear other voices. She could hear, through the thin walls, her cousin Becky's voice on the phone with Clara's aunt, because that was how fast news traveled through Millbrook County, saying, Did you hear what Clara did today? She bought a piece of junk property out on Old Mill Creek. She has lost her mind. She has absolutely lost her mind. Honestly, somebody needs to talk to her before she drags that poor child down with her. Clara laid down next to Lily that night and listened to her daughter breathe, and she whispered, very quietly, into the dark, I have not lost my mind. I have finally used it. And she did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, she slept without the dream of eviction for the first time in 4 months. The following morning, Clara was back at the farmhouse by 9. She had brought work gloves, a dust mask from the dollar store, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a broom, a bucket, and a thermos of coffee. She had also borrowed a pry bar from Mrs. Pettigrew's garage, a heavy old tool with a rust-pitted handle that had belonged to Mrs. Pettigrew's late husband. Mrs. Pettigrew had pressed it into Clara's hands and said, Honey, you take whatever you need. Just bring it back when you are done, and if you need a hand, you call me. Clara had nodded and had not told her exactly what she was going to do with the pry bar. She started with the obvious work, the work any sensible person would have started with. She swept the glass off the parlor floor. She pulled the old braided rug out the front door and onto the grass where she would deal with it later. She knocked down the cobwebs from the corners with her broom. She opened every window that would open, which was 3 of them, and let the summer air push some of the staleness out of the house. She worked for about 2 hours, sweating through her shirt, her hair tied back with a rubber band, and every few minutes she walked past the dining room and looked at the paneled wall and then made herself go back to work. Around noon, she stopped and sat on the front porch and drank her coffee, and she let herself think about what she had seen the day before. The brass fitting in the wood, the hair-thin gap at the top of the paneling. The way the workmanship of that wall was better than the workmanship of anything else in the house. She thought about Margaret Holloway, the woman who had lived here alone and died here alone and left no heirs. She thought about the photograph on the parlor wall, the young couple, the kind face. She thought about what a person might hide and why. She did not know anything about Margaret Holloway yet. She did not know what the woman had done for a living, or what her husband had done, or what they had feared, or what they had treasured. But she knew that people did not build hidden walls for nothing. People built hidden walls because they had something on the other side of the wall that mattered enough to hide. She finished her coffee. She walked back into the dining room. She stood in front of the paneled wall with the pry bar in her hand. She took a slow breath. She did not start with the pry bar. Before she tore into anything, she wanted to understand what she was looking at. She knelt down and ran her fingers along the baseboard at the foot of the wall. She felt every seam. She found another small indentation near the floor, a second brass fitting, this one even smaller than the first. She stood up and ran her flashlight along the ceiling line, and she found a third. 3 fittings. 3 points. She did not know what that meant. Then she pressed her ear against the wood and knocked on different sections of the wall, softly, listening. Most of the wall gave back a dull, solid sound, the sound of wood paneling over plaster over stud. But one section, about 3 feet wide in the center of the wall, gave back a slightly different sound. Not hollow exactly, but different, denser in some way, as if behind that section there was something other than the framing of a normal wall. Clara stepped back. She did not have the tools she needed. She had a pry bar and not much else, and she did not want to just start ripping boards off the wall without some idea of how they fit together. She needed better light. She needed measurements. She needed, most of all, to not be stupid about this, because if there was something behind this wall, there would be 1 chance to find it the right way, and 1,000 chances to find it the wrong way and wreck it. She thought about the pry bar in her hand. She thought about the $47 in her envelope, now $37 after the gas for 2 trips to the farmhouse. She thought about Lily, who needed shoes. She thought about the electricity bill on her kitchen counter. She made a decision. She was going to come back tomorrow with better tools. She was going to borrow a drill from Mrs. Pettigrew's garage, or from the feed store owner who had known her father, or from anyone who would lend one to a woman with no credit and a $10 house. She was going to take her time. She was going to do this right. She packed up her things and locked the door of the house with the brass key on its faded red ribbon. She drove home in the late afternoon light, and the truck coughed on the hill near Brennerville but made it. And by the time she got home, Lily was already back from school, being minded by Mrs. Pettigrew, who had brought over a tuna casserole because she said she had made too much for one old woman. Clara hugged Mrs. Pettigrew. She ate the casserole with Lily at the little kitchen table. She did not mention the wall. She did not mention the fittings. She did not mention that her heart had been racing all day. That night, after Lily was asleep, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and typed the name Margaret Holloway into the search bar. She added the name of the county. She hit enter. The results were thin, but there were results. A brief obituary from 2019 in a local paper. A reference to a Margaret and Thomas Holloway in a history of Millbrook County dairy farming from the 1980s. A scan of an old newspaper article from 1963 about a woman named Margaret Holloway who had won a county fair blue ribbon for her preserved peaches. Clara read the obituary. Margaret Holloway, age 91, had died at her home on Old Mill Creek Road. She was preceded in death by her husband Thomas, her son Daniel, and her brother Walter. She was survived by no immediate family. In lieu of flowers, donations could be made to the County Historical Society. Clara read the obituary 3 times. She looked at the picture that accompanied it, a black and white photograph of Margaret Holloway as a young woman, the same young woman from the photograph in the parlor. She had a long face, dark hair pulled back, and eyes that looked directly at the camera with a quality Clara could not quite name. Steadiness, a kind of patient intelligence. Clara closed her laptop. She sat for a long time in the dim kitchen and thought about a 91-year-old woman who had lived alone on 32 acres and had died there and had left behind a house with a hidden wall. She thought about what Margaret might have been hiding and from whom. She thought about how sometimes the people who looked the quietest had the loudest stories. She thought that tomorrow she would go back and she would start to find out. She did not sleep much that night. The next morning she was up before dawn. She kissed Lily on the forehead before the little girl had even stirred, and she left a note on the counter. She stopped at the feed store before it opened and sat in the parking lot waiting, and when old Mr. Danvers rolled up the metal shutters at 7, she went in and asked him if she could borrow a drill. Mr. Danvers had known her father 20 years ago. He looked her up and down and asked what she needed it for. She said she had bought a property and was doing some work on it, and she could not afford to buy a drill yet, but she would be careful with his. Mr. Danvers said he had 2 drills. He pulled an old Black & Decker from the back of his shop, a workhorse with a frayed cord that he said still ran like a dream, and he gave her a set of bits with it. He said she could keep it for a week. He said when her father had been alive, he had borrowed tools from Mr. Danvers all the time and had always brought them back. He said he expected the same from her. Clara thanked him, and she almost cried in the feed store, and she did not. By 9, she was at the farmhouse. By 9:15, she was standing in front of the paneled wall with the drill in one hand and the pry bar in the other, and her hands shaking slightly. She set the drill down on the dining room table. She set the pry bar next to it. She put on her work gloves. She pulled the dust mask up over her mouth and nose. She took a breath. She stepped forward. Before she could begin, she heard tires on the gravel outside. She froze, the drill still in her hand. She was not expecting anyone. Nobody knew she was out here. She set the drill down quietly and walked to the parlor window and peeked out through the grime. A dark green pickup truck was pulling up her driveway, a truck she did not recognize, and a man was climbing out of it. He was tall, maybe in his 60s, wearing work jeans and a flannel shirt and a ball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was walking toward the porch like a man who had walked toward it many times before. Clara opened the front door before he could knock. She stood there in her dust mask and her work gloves and tried to look like she belonged there, because she did belong there. She owned the place. She kept reminding herself of that as the man stopped on the second step and looked up at her with an expression that was more surprised than friendly. He said, "Ma'am, I was not expecting to see anybody here." Clara pulled down her mask. "I could say the same thing. Can I help you?" The man took off his cap and held it in his hands in front of him. He was older up close than he had looked from the window, maybe closer to 70, with weathered skin and gray at his temples. He said his name was Earl Vickers. He said he had known Margaret Holloway for 40 years. He said he had been driving down the road and had seen a truck in the driveway and had stopped because he wanted to know who was poking around the old place. Clara said the old place belonged to her now. She had bought it from the county 3 days ago. The paperwork was in her truck if he wanted to see it. Earl Vickers looked at her for a long time, and Clara could not tell if he was angry or surprised or something else entirely. Then he said, "Ma'am, I apologize. I did not mean to come on your property without invitation. I should go." He turned and started back toward his truck. Clara heard herself say, "Mr. Vickers, wait." He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and turned back. She said, "You knew Margaret. You knew her for a long time." "I did not know her at all. I have been in her house, and I do not know the first thing about who she was. If you have a minute, I would like to hear." Earl Vickers stood there with his cap in his hands and looked at the ground for a long moment. Then he climbed back up onto the porch and sat down on the top step and gestured for Clara to sit beside him. She did. The boards of the porch creaked under them both. He said Margaret Holloway had been the finest woman he had ever known who was not his own mother. He said she had been tough and quiet and smart in ways that did not announce themselves. He said her husband Thomas had farmed this land for 30 years, mostly dairy cows and some hay, and he had been a good man, plain and steady. He said they had lost their only son Daniel in a tractor accident when Daniel was 19, and after that, something had gone out of Thomas that never came back, and Thomas had died of a heart attack 6 years later. Margaret had buried her husband and her son within a decade, and she had stayed on that farm alone for another 35 years, refusing every offer to buy her out, refusing every suggestion from well-meaning neighbors that she move into town. She had raised chickens. She had kept a garden. She had read books from the library every week until she got too frail to drive. Earl had brought her groceries for the last 8 years of her life. He had sat at her kitchen table and had coffee with her every Thursday afternoon. He said she had been one of his closest friends in the world. Clara listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap. Earl said, "Margaret was a private woman. She did not talk about herself much, but I knew her well enough to know she had stories. Things from before she married Thomas. Things from a long time ago. She hinted at them sometimes, and she never finished the hints. I asked her once, point blank, what she had done before she came to Millbrook, and she laughed and said, 'Earl, if I told you half of it, you would not believe me. And if I told you the other half, you would tell somebody, and I cannot have that.' She never brought it up again, and I never asked again." Clara felt the hair on the back of her neck lift. She said, "Mr. Vickers, when was the last time you were inside this house?" He said, "The day after Margaret died. Her lawyer asked me to come in with him and make sure nothing valuable was left sitting out before the county took possession. We looked through the main rooms. We did not find anything much. Some old photographs. Her clothes. Her books. Nothing worth a dime, in dollar terms. We left it all where it was." He shook his head. "I always thought that was strange." Clara said, "What was strange?" He said, "Margaret lived modestly, but she was not poor. She paid her bills on time. She tipped generously when she had help. She bought good books and good coffee. And when I cleaned her house after she died, I did not find a checkbook. I did not find any bank statements. I did not find any cash. Her lawyer said she had a small account at the credit union in town with about $4,000 in it, which went to pay her funeral and the back taxes on the property until the county got involved. But I knew her for 40 years, and I helped her carry groceries, and I am telling you, she did not spend $4,000 worth a year. She spent less. She saved. She had to have had money somewhere. We just never found it." Clara looked at Earl Vickers. Earl Vickers looked at Clara. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Earl said, "Ma'am, I do not know what you are doing in this house. I do not know you, but I liked Margaret, and I respected her, and I want you to know something. If you find anything in there that seems important, I am not here to claim it. I have no interest. She had no family and no will, and the county owns what the county owns. Whatever is in that house now is yours, legal and moral both. I just want to ask one thing of you. If you find something that tells you who she was, I would like to know. That is all. Not the money, if there is money. Just the story. She was my friend, and I have always wondered." Clara promised him that if she found anything, she would tell him. He wrote his phone number on a scrap of paper she tore from her work notebook. He put his cap back on and stood up and walked back to his truck, and before he got in, he turned and looked at the house one last time, and Clara saw an old man's grief pass across his face and then pass away again. Then he got in his truck and drove off down the gravel road, and Clara sat alone on the porch for a while longer. She thought about what he had told her. Margaret had saved. Margaret had lived modestly. Margaret had hinted at stories from before. Margaret had told Earl that if she told him half of it, he would not believe him, and if she told him the other half, he would tell somebody. That was not the sentence of a woman who had simply grown up poor and married a dairy farmer. That was the sentence of a woman with a past. And a past, Clara thought, could be a dangerous thing to carry. A past could be something you hid from. A past could also be something you protected, which was not quite the same. She went back inside. She picked up the drill. She started with the brass fitting at chest height. She put the tip of her pry bar against the paneling next to the fitting, and she worked it carefully under the edge of the board, and she pulled. The board did not give at first. She worked it again. The nail holding the board creaked. She pulled harder. There was a sharp crack as the wood yielded, and a long strip of dark paneling came away from the wall and fell to the floor with a clatter that made Clara's heart stop. She worked for the next 3 hours without stopping. She removed the paneling one board at a time, carefully, trying not to damage the boards themselves, numbering them in pencil on the back so she could put them back up if she had to. She discovered as she worked that the paneling had not been nailed directly to the studs the way it would be in ordinary construction. It had been nailed to a frame, and the frame had been nailed to the studs, and between the frame and the plaster of the original wall, there was a gap of about 4 inches. 4 inches of empty space that should not have been there. She removed the boards steadily, sweating, her arms aching. She did not stop to eat. She did not stop to drink. She worked until she had cleared an area about 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, and then she set the drill down and picked up her flashlight, and she looked. What she was looking at was not a wall. It was a door. The door was made of steel. It was painted the same dark color as the wood paneling that had covered it, which was why it had not betrayed itself through the seams. It was a heavy steel door, flush-mounted into a frame that had been built into the original plaster wall and then concealed behind the false paneling. The door had no visible handle, no visible hinges, nothing that suggested a door from the outside. But there was a small brass keyhole in the center of the door, and there was a faint seam around the edges where the door met the frame, and there was the unmistakable solidity of a surface that was not meant to be passed through without permission. Clara sat down on the floor of the dining room in front of the door, and she stared at it. She stared at it for a long time. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking, actually, not from fear, from something closer to awe. Margaret Holloway had built a vault into the dining room wall of her farmhouse. A vault. A real one. Clara had seen enough movies to know what a vault looked like, and this was a vault, or something close to one. Who had Margaret Holloway been? Who built something like this, and why? She needed a key, and for a moment, Clara Bennett forgot how to breathe. She needed a key, and she had no idea where to look for one. Clara sat on the dusty floor of the dining room for a long time, staring at the steel door set flush into the wall, her flashlight resting beside her hip, the pry bar across her lap. The afternoon light through the broken window was turning gold. Somewhere outside a mourning dove was calling. The sound was so ordinary and the thing in front of her was so extraordinary that for a moment Clara felt dizzy, as if the whole room had tilted. She pressed her palm flat against the steel and felt how cold it was, cold the way metal gets when it has been sealed up for decades in a wall where no heat reaches it. She tried to imagine Margaret Holloway, old and thin and white-haired, kneeling in this very spot. Did she ever open this door? Did she come in here at night with a cup of tea in her hand and sit where Clara was sitting now and just look? Or had she walled it up and never touched it again? Clara stood up. Her knees ached. Her back ached. She had been working for hours and had not eaten since morning. But the exhaustion had dropped away when she saw the door, and now that the adrenaline was settling, she realized she was shaking not just from what she had seen, but from hunger. She walked outside to her truck and pulled the peanut butter sandwich from the small cooler on the passenger seat and ate it standing on the porch, looking out over the overgrown front yard, trying to think. A key, she thought. Margaret would not have left a vault in her wall without some way to open it. If Margaret had wanted the vault sealed forever, she would have welded the door shut or filled the cavity with concrete. She had not done either of those things. She had installed a keyhole, which meant she had expected someone, someday, to use a key. That someone might have been her husband Thomas, while he was alive. It might have been her son Daniel, before he died. Or, Clara thought carefully, it might have been whoever came after her. It might have been whoever inherited her house, which was now, by the strange, unsentimental arithmetic of the county tax office, Clara herself. The key had to be somewhere. Somewhere on the property. Somewhere Margaret had put it. Old women who lived alone for 35 years developed habits about where they put things that mattered. Clara thought about her own grandmother, who had kept her wedding ring in a tobacco tin in the drawer of her sewing machine for 40 years, because that was the one place she knew she would not forget it. Margaret would have had a place like that. A place she trusted. A place she could find in the dark. Clara walked back inside and began to search the house properly. She started in the kitchen. She opened every drawer, every cabinet, every canister. She found bent measuring spoons and rusted can openers and a jar full of rubber bands, so old they crumbled when she touched them. She found a drawer of yellowed newspaper clippings, recipes clipped from magazines in the 1970s, birthday cards from people whose names she did not recognize. In a tin on top of the refrigerator, she found a stack of dollar bills, $62 in crumpled singles, wrapped in a rubber band that broke when she touched it. She set the money aside on the kitchen table. She was not going to keep it, she decided, until she knew more. It was not hers. Not yet. But it was not nothing, either. $62 was 2 weeks of groceries for her, and Lily if she was careful. She moved to the parlor. She checked behind the framed photographs. She tipped the ceramic birds on the mantel one at a time, looking for anything taped underneath. She lifted the cushions of the sofa, gingerly, because she could hear mice scuttle away from the disturbance. She opened the grandfather clock and looked inside the case, and there was nothing there but the dead mechanism and a long pendulum that had stopped swinging years ago. She felt along the top of every doorframe. She crouched down and looked under every piece of furniture. She went upstairs. The stairs creaked under her weight in ways that made her move slowly, one careful step at a time, holding onto the banister but not trusting it. At the top of the stairs was a landing with 3 doors leading off it. The first door opened onto a bathroom, a small one with a clawfoot tub and a cracked mirror and a window so filthy the light came through it gray. The second door opened onto a bedroom that had clearly been Margaret's, a double bed made up with a quilt so faded the pattern was almost invisible, a dresser with a mirror, a nightstand with a lamp, and a Bible on it. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment without going in. It felt wrong, somehow, to walk into this room, though she could not have said why. Then she went in, because she had to. The bed was neatly made. The quilt on top was the kind an old woman made with her own hands over many winters, squares of fabric from dresses and shirts she had once owned, stitched together with patience. Clara lifted the pillow and looked underneath. Nothing. She pulled back the quilt carefully. The sheets were dusty but unstained. The mattress was old and sagged in the middle. She knelt down and looked under the bed. There was a small cardboard box. She pulled it out. The dust on the lid was thick. She lifted the lid. Inside were letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, maybe 40 of them, all addressed to Margaret in a man's careful handwriting. The return address was Thomas Holloway, and the postmarks were from 1952. Love letters from her husband-to-be, preserved for 72 years. Clara's throat tightened. She did not open the letters. They were not hers to read. She put the lid back on the box and slid it back under the bed where Margaret had wanted it to stay. She stood up and opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside was a pair of reading glasses with a cracked lens, a small bottle of hand lotion, a rosary, and a folded handkerchief. Under the handkerchief, she found a photograph. It was not the wedding photograph from downstairs. This was a photograph of a young woman, maybe 18 or 19 years old, standing in front of a building Clara did not recognize, a tall brick building with a sign she could not quite read. The young woman was Margaret. Clara was sure of it. The same long face, the same dark hair, the same direct eyes. But the Margaret in this photograph was wearing a tailored dark coat and a hat, and she was holding what looked like a small leather briefcase. And she was not smiling, exactly, but she had the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of her mouth, as if she were about to do something she was not going to tell anyone about. On the back of the photograph, in pencil, In the same handwriting Clara had seen on the envelope in the vault was written, New York, November 1950. Clara sat down on the edge of the bed and held the photograph in her hand for a long time. New York, November 1950. Margaret would have been, Clara did the math, 19 years old. Before Thomas. Before Millbrook. Before whatever life she had built in this house on this road. Margaret had been in New York City at 19, wearing a tailored coat and carrying a briefcase, and smiling in a way that said she knew things she was not telling. Clara did not know what the photograph meant, but she knew it meant something. She put the photograph carefully back into the drawer where she had found it. She would not take it. She would not disturb it. Whatever she learned today, or tomorrow, or next month, Margaret's things belonged in Margaret's house, in the places Margaret had chosen for them, for as long as Clara had any say in the matter. She kept searching. She found the key by accident, and she found it in the place Margaret had probably hidden it first, which was not even a hiding place, really, but a thing that would only look like a hiding place to someone who was looking for one. It was in the Bible on the nightstand. Clara picked the Bible up to look behind it, the way she had looked behind every other object in the room. And the Bible was heavier than a Bible should be, and when she opened it she saw that a rectangle of pages in the middle had been cut out with a razor to form a small cavity. Inside the cavity was a small velvet pouch. Inside the pouch was a key. Clara lifted the key out with fingers that were not steady. It was a brass key, smaller than the one for the front door, with a distinctive head shaped like a shield, and it matched the keyhole in the steel door. It had to. Margaret had cut a Bible and hidden this key inside it, because a woman like Margaret knew that nobody robs the Bible of a dead old lady. Clara almost laughed. She almost cried. She did neither. She slipped the key into her pocket, and she walked slowly downstairs. The sun was lower now. The dining room was dim. She turned on her flashlight and knelt in front of the steel door and fit the key into the brass keyhole. It did not turn. She tried again. She pushed harder. The key went in, but would not rotate. Clara's stomach dropped. She pulled the key out and looked at it in her palm, and then she looked at the door and she understood, with a sinking feeling, that she had found one of two keys. Margaret had been careful. Margaret had not trusted a single point of failure. There was another key somewhere. There had to be. She went back upstairs. She searched the second bedroom, which had probably been Daniel's when he was alive. A small room with a twin bed and a bookcase full of boys' adventure novels, and a model airplane hanging from the ceiling by a thread that was about to break. She searched the bathroom. She searched the landing. She searched the hall closet. She came back down and went through the kitchen again. She went out to the porch and sat down on the steps, and she closed her eyes, and she tried to think like Margaret Holloway. If I hide one key in a Bible, she thought, where do I hide the other one? Not in the house, she decided, after a moment. Margaret had been the kind of woman who would not keep all her eggs in one basket. If one key was in the house, the other key was somewhere else. Somewhere on the property. Somewhere outside. Somewhere a burglar who broke into the house would never think to look. Clara stood up and walked out into the yard. She walked around the house once, slowly, looking at everything. She walked past the collapsed chicken coop. She walked past the rusted tractor. She walked down the path toward the old garden. She looked at the apple tree and the pear tree. She looked at the well. She knelt by the well and looked down into it with her flashlight. And the water was dark and deep, and she could not see the bottom, and she did not think Margaret would have dropped a key down her own well. She looked at the well house, a small wooden structure with a pitched roof and a door that hung crooked on one hinge. She went inside the well house. The air smelled of earth and old rope. There was a pump handle bolted to the top of the well casing, and a shelf on the wall, and on the shelf a row of old glass jars, cloudy with dust. She picked up each jar and looked into it. Rusty nails in one, washers in another, a jar full of brass buttons, which Clara thought was a strange thing for a farmwife to collect. The last jar at the end of the shelf was smaller than the others, and it had a lid that was screwed on tight. Clara unscrewed it. Inside was a brass key on a small loop of faded red ribbon, identical to the one she had found in the Bible. Clara closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Margaret. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." She carried the second key back to the house. She knelt in front of the steel door. She fit the first key into the keyhole on the left side of the lock mechanism, which she had not noticed as a separate opening until now. She fit the second key into the keyhole on the right side. She turned them both at the same time. There was a soft click, heavier than the first click had been. It was the sound of tumblers falling into place, the sound of something that had been locked a very long time consenting, finally, to be opened. The door did not swing free on its own. It was too heavy. Clara had to brace her foot against the wall and pull, and even then it resisted her, the hinges protesting with a low metallic groan. The door came open one slow inch at a time, and as it opened, the air inside the vault came out. And it was a dry, dusty, cool air, the air of a space that had been sealed away from the world, and Clara breathed it in, and she knew she was breathing something nobody else had breathed in decades. She lifted her flashlight. She had seen the shelves once already, through the narrow gap she had made by removing the paneling. Now, with the door fully open, she saw them properly. The vault was lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, and on the shelves were arranged, with the precision of a woman who had taken her time, a great many things. On the top shelf, a row of leather-bound books. Clara counted 8. The spines were gold-lettered, cracked with age, but the lettering was still legible. She read them one by one. A book of Keats, a book of Yeats, a book called A Christmas Carol, and another called Great Expectations. An old edition of Huckleberry Finn, a small volume that was unmarked on the spine. A thick book called The Complete Poems of Emily Dickinson. And at the end of the row, pressed against the side of the vault, a small book with a dark red cover and no title at all. On the second shelf, the wooden boxes. Clara counted 6. They were different sizes. Some were maybe 6 inches square, others were longer, shallower, more like small trays. Each one was labeled on its side in a neat handwritten script. Clara read the labels from left to right. The first one said coins, silver. The second said coins, gold. The third said rings and chains. The fourth said watches. The fifth said loose stones. The sixth said miscellaneous. Clara stared at the labels. She did not open any of the boxes. Not yet. On the third shelf, the framed photographs faced down, as she had seen before. She counted 4 of them. On the bottom shelf, the linen-wrapped bundles. There were 3 of them. The largest was about the size of a watermelon. The others were smaller, flatter, more like stacks of something wrapped in cloth. And pinned to the back wall of the vault, where it had been before, was the envelope with the yellowed paper, the envelope she had already taken down, which she now held in her lap. Clara sat back on her heels. She had to open the envelope first. She had to know what Margaret wanted her to know before she touched anything else, because anything else she touched might come with rules Margaret had set, and it would be rude, and it would be wrong to start taking inventory of another woman's secrets without reading the letter that woman had left for whoever found them. She opened the envelope carefully. The flap was sealed with a dab of glue that had long since given way, and the paper inside came out in a small folded stack, maybe 4 pages of thin stationery. Covered on both sides in the same careful sloping handwriting she had seen on the envelope and on the back of the photograph upstairs. There was something else in the envelope, too. Clara pulled it out. It was a smaller, sealed envelope, addressed in the same handwriting, with a single line on the front, for the taxman, if he comes. Clara set that smaller envelope aside on the floor beside her. She unfolded the letter. She read it in the light of her flashlight, sitting on the floor of a house that was not yet hers in any way but on paper, with the sun setting outside and the insects beginning to sing in the fields. It began, "Dear whoever you are, I do not know your name. I do not know when you will read this. I am 78 years old today, and the doctor in Brennerville has told me my heart is not what it was, and I have decided this week to write down some things and put them in this box where I have put other things, for someone who might come someday. If you are reading this, it means the house was sold or given up to the tax rolls, and someone has torn down the wall I put up, and that someone, by whatever road, is you. Please forgive me the theater of it. I was in the theater once, in a manner of speaking, and I learned to enjoy a good entrance." Clara read the sentence twice. She was in the theater once, in a manner of speaking. She kept reading. "My name is Margaret Elizabeth Holloway, born Margaret Elizabeth Vance, in the city of Boston in 1931. I grew up the youngest of 7 children in a family that had once had money and had lost most of it before I was born. My father was a lawyer, a good one, who drank too much, and my mother was a pianist who never played in public because my father did not approve of it. I was a bright girl. I did not like Boston. I did not like my parents' house. I finished my schooling at 16, and I left home at 17, and I went to New York City, and I did not speak to my family again for 22 years. Clara's hands were cold. I worked in New York for 7 years. I will not write what I did there. It is not a thing I am ashamed of, but it is a thing I learned to keep to myself, and I have kept it to myself for 70 years, and I am not going to stop now, even for you. I will tell you this. I worked for a man named Edwin Vance, who was my father's cousin, and who did not drink and did not have my father's weaknesses, and who treated me, when I came to him hungry and half-frozen in 1948, as if I were his own daughter. He was a dealer in certain kinds of goods. He traded in things that could be moved quietly between certain kinds of people who did not want to be seen trading them. He was not a criminal. He was a businessman. There is a difference, though in some years the law does not always agree, and I will leave you to judge whether the difference matters. He taught me the trade. I had an eye for it from the first week I walked into his office, and he told me so, and within a year I was doing half his buying for him, and within 3 years I was doing most of it, and when he died in 1955, he left me what you see in this vault. There was more. I have sold things over the years when I needed to. I have sold a watch here and a ring there, and once, in 1971, a small landscape by a painter whose name you would know, to pay for my son's college tuition, which he did not live to use. What you see here is the remainder. Clara stopped reading. She was shaking. She had to stop reading for a moment because her hands were shaking too hard to hold the paper. She set the letter down on the floor. She looked at the vault. She looked at the 6 wooden boxes and the 3 linen-wrapped bundles. She looked at her hand. She looked at the letter. She picked the letter up again. I came to Millbrook in 1956 because Edwin had left me his Connecticut farmhouse and I sold it. And with the money I bought this land, which was cheap because there had been a drought and the dairy operation that had been on it had failed. I met Thomas Holloway in the spring of '57 at a church supper I went to because I was lonely, and we married in the fall, and he was the kindest man I ever knew, and he never once asked me what I had done before I came here, and I never once told him. Thomas thought my small savings had come from a modest inheritance, which was not untrue, as far as it went. I never used the things in this vault during his lifetime except twice. Once to save the farm in 1963 when the milk prices collapsed, and once to pay for Daniel's tuition in 1971. Thomas did not know about the vault. Daniel did not know about the vault. I was never going to tell them, and I never did. And they are both gone now, and the secret is mine alone to give or to bury. I am giving it to you. Clara's eyes stung. She wiped them with the back of her wrist and kept reading. I do not know who you are. I do not know why you came to this house, or how. The world may be very different by the time you read this. The things in this vault may be worth very little, or they may be worth a great deal. I have kept a list, which you will find in the red-covered book on the top shelf, of what each thing is and where it came from, and what a reputable appraiser in the year 1985 valued each of them at. You will need a new appraiser for current values. I would recommend, if the firm is still in business, Halverson and Sons in New York City, which was Edwin's firm, and which I trust to be fair and discreet. Tell them only that you inherited the collection from a private estate in Millbrook County. Tell them nothing of me. That is my only request, as a matter of my own dignity. Everything else is yours. There is one more thing I want to say to you, whoever you are. I lived in this house for 68 years. I lost my son and my husband. I made a life here from the pieces of 2 lives, the one I had before and the one I made after, and both of those lives were mine, and neither of them was anyone's to take from me, and I do not regret either of them. I am telling you this because you may find, as you take these things out of this vault, that you are becoming afraid. You may think people will come. You may think someone will want to take these things from you. They will not. The people who knew what this collection was are all dead. The records Edwin kept were destroyed when his office burned in '73. The things themselves are yours, and they are clean, in the sense that the law cares about cleanness, because I have paid tax on every sale I ever made, and I have kept the receipts, which are in the miscellaneous box, in case the tax man ever does come asking. If he does come, give him the envelope I have left beside this letter. It is addressed to him, and it contains a letter of provenance signed by my lawyer in 1990 and notarized, and it will put to bed any question he has. My lawyer's name was Harold Devane. He died in 2004. His son still practices in Brennerville. You can look him up. Clara was weeping now, silently, sitting on the floor of a dining room in a house she had bought for $10 from a man who had told her she was making a mistake. She did not know she was weeping until a tear fell onto the letter and the ink smudged, and she pulled the paper back quickly and wiped her face on her sleeve and kept reading. One last thing. Whatever you do with what you find here, I hope you will use some of it for someone other than yourself. That is not a condition. The things are yours without conditions. But I am an old woman writing a letter to a stranger I will never meet, and an old woman is entitled to a little preaching. I kept these things my whole life because I never had a good reason to let them go. You have a reason. I do not know what your reason is, but you have one, because people who walk into my empty house and tear down my wall have reasons. Use them. Do not waste them. Do not spend them on small things. Find the large things in your life, the things that matter, the people you love, and let these objects be in service of those things. They were gathered, in their own strange way, by one woman's strange life. Let them flower into something good in another woman's better one. Go with my love, whoever you are. Margaret Elizabeth Holloway, May 4th, 2009. Clara sat for a long time with the letter in her lap. The sun outside had set. The dining room was almost dark. She could barely see the letter anymore, but she did not need to see it. She had read it. She had read every word of it. She knew what was in front of her, and she knew what the woman who had left it had wanted her to do with it. She sat there with her flashlight beam on the shelves of the vault, and she thought about Margaret at 19 in a tailored coat in New York City, and Margaret at 26 widowed from a country life that had only just begun, and Margaret at 80 who had written this letter with a hand that had finally begun to tremble, preparing for a stranger who would one day find her vault. And Clara, who had come looking for a house because she and her daughter had nowhere to live, understood that she had just been handed a life. She set the letter down. She turned to the shelves. She reached, very carefully, for the red-covered book at the end of the top row. The book was about 6 inches tall, bound in soft red leather that had cracked at the corners. There was no title on the cover or the spine. Clara opened it. Inside, the pages were lined, and every page was filled with Margaret's handwriting, the same careful sloping hand that had written the letter. At the top of the first page, in letters slightly larger than the rest, was written inventory, and below that, a date. June, 1985. The first entry was a pocket watch. Gold, hunter-cased, engraved with the initials E.B.V. on the front case. Manufactured by Patek Philippe, Geneva, circa 1880. Movement serial number listed. Provenance, acquired by E. Vance, March 1952, from an estate sale in Philadelphia. Documentation, bill of sale, file 4. Appraised 1985 at $24,000. Clara blinked. She read the entry again to make sure she had read it correctly. $24,000 in 1985. She turned the page. The second entry was a ring. A lady's ring, platinum band with a center diamond of 3 1/4 carats, surrounded by 12 smaller diamonds, made by a New York jeweler Clara had never heard of. Provenance, a widow's estate, 1954. Appraised in 1985 at $38,000. Clara closed her eyes. She opened them. She turned the page. The entries kept going. A set of 10 gold coins, American, minted between 1880 and 1905, appraised at $12,500. A necklace of natural pearls, appraised at $19,000. A sapphire brooch, appraised at $15,000. A pair of emerald earrings, appraised at $22,000. A small oil painting, unframed, Dutch, 17th century, appraised at $60,000. A pair of silver candlesticks, Paul de Lamery, London, 1738, appraised at $31,000. A first edition of a book Clara had heard of but never read, appraised at $9,000. A leather-bound manuscript that had been presented to someone in 1863, appraised at $47,000. A set of 3 medieval illuminated pages, removed from a manuscript, appraised at $110,000. Clara kept turning pages. The book was 60 pages long, and there was an entry on every page, sometimes 2 or 3 entries per page, and each entry had a dollar amount next to it in Margaret's careful hand. When Clara reached the last page, she turned back to the first page, and she did the thing she had not let herself do until she had seen every entry, which was to add up the numbers. She did not have a calculator, and she was not going to get one. She added them up on a scrap of paper by the light of her flashlight, the way her father had taught her to do arithmetic in her head when she was a little girl. The total in Margaret Holloway's inventory, at 1985 appraisal values, was $2,147,600. Clara stared at the number. She had written it on the scrap of paper in pencil. 2,147,600. She read it slowly, one digit at a time, and she did not quite believe it, and she checked her addition twice, and she got the same number both times. Then she remembered that those were $1985, and that it was not 1985 anymore, and she had grown up poor, but she had grown up knowing a little about how inflation worked, and she knew that $1 in 1985 was worth something close to $3 now, not even counting how much certain kinds of antiques and jewels and rare books had appreciated in their own right, independent of inflation, over 40 years. She was looking at $6 million. Maybe more. Maybe much more. She set the book down. She stood up. She walked out of the dining room. She walked through the parlor. She walked out the front door and onto the porch, and she stood on the porch in the twilight, and she leaned on the railing, and she breathed. In and out. In and out. The air was cooling. The cicadas had started. In the far distance, a dog was barking from someone's farm 2 or 3 miles away, the sound traveling clear across the fields. Above the pines, the first stars were coming out. Clara stood there, and she let herself feel, for a few moments, what she had been not feeling all day, all week, all month, all year. The tiredness, the rent coming due, the electricity about to be cut off, the shoes Lily needed, the calls from the bill collectors, the cousin on the phone saying she had lost her mind, the girl at the gas station laughing, the neighbor Doyle laughing, Mrs. Corbin saying she should have used the $10 for groceries. The whole long, slow, accumulated weight of being poor in a country that was not sure it wanted her to stop being poor. Clara stood on Margaret Holloway's porch in the dusk, and she let that weight loosen and lift, and she did not let herself believe, yet, that it was gone, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her never to count money that was not in her hand. But she let herself believe, for the first time in a very long time, that it might loosen, that it might lift, that there might be a life beyond this one. She thought of Lily. Lily in her bed in the trailer, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her shoes falling apart. Lily at 7 years old, who had never had a room of her own. Lily who had hugged her neck so tight 2 nights ago when Clara had told her they had a house. Clara Bennett stood on the porch, and she said out loud, to nobody, to Margaret, maybe, to the stars, she said, "Thank you." Then she went back inside. She did not open any of the wooden boxes that night. She did not unwrap any of the linen bundles. She locked the steel door with both keys. She put the keys in her pocket. She put the letter and the inventory book and the small sealed envelope, addressed to the taxman, back inside her coat. She closed up the paneling as best she could with a few loose boards leaned in place, not refastened, just enough to keep an insect or an animal from going in. She took one last look around the dining room. She said out loud, "To the house, see you tomorrow." She drove home. When she got home, it was almost 9. Mrs. Pettigrew had fed Lily and put her to bed, and Clara stood in the doorway of her daughter's tiny room and watched Lily sleep, and she almost told her. She almost whispered it into her daughter's ear. She did not. It was too much. It was too much to put on a 7-year-old, and besides, Clara herself did not trust it yet. She needed to sleep on it. She needed to see it in the morning. She needed to drive to Brennerville in the morning and find out if Halverson and Sons in New York was still in business, and if so, how to contact them, and what they would need from her, and how long it would take, and what they would charge, and whether the things in Margaret's vault were in fact what Margaret said they were. Because 40 years was a long time. Tastes changed. Values changed. Some of what Margaret had listed might be worth more now, and some might be worth less. Clara did not know. Clara did not know anything, yet, except what Margaret had said in her letter, and what a woman had written in a book in 1985. She slept that night without dreams. In the morning, she got up before Lily. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table, and she opened her laptop, and she typed Halverson and Sons New York City into the search bar. She held her breath. The firm existed. The firm was now called Halverson Partners, and it had a website, and it was located on East 57th Street, and it advertised itself as specialists in fine jewelry, watches, antiquities, rare books, and private estate appraisals. Clara read the About page. The firm had been founded in 1938 by Leonard Halverson. Leonard had died in 1990. His son Peter had taken over. Peter had died in 2014. Peter's daughter Rebecca now ran the firm. There was a phone number. There was an email address. There was a short paragraph about the firm's discretion and their long relationships with private collectors. Clara looked at the phone number for a long time. She thought about calling it. She thought about saying, "My name is Clara Bennett. I am calling on behalf of an estate in Millbrook County, and I have a collection I would like to have appraised." She did not call it yet. She was not quite ready. She needed to do one more thing first. She drove to Brennerville. She parked in front of the law office of Decaying and Associates, which was on the second floor of a brick building above a coffee shop. She climbed the stairs. She told the receptionist, a woman about her own age named Patty, that she needed to speak with whichever Devane was available about a matter involving a former client of the late Harold Devane. Patty asked her to wait. 10 minutes later, a man in his 50s came out of an office in the back, gray-haired, wearing glasses, and he introduced himself as Robert Devane, Harold's son. He shook Clara's hand. He led her back to his office. Clara sat down across from him. She put the sealed envelope from Margaret on his desk. She said, "Mr. Devane, I believe your father drew up a letter of provenance for a woman named Margaret Holloway in 1990. I bought Mrs. Holloway's property last week from the county. I found this envelope in her house. It is addressed to the tax man, but I would like you to open it first and tell me whether it is what I think it is, because I need to know if what I found in her house is actually mine, and if it is, I need to know what to do about it." Robert Devane looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his hands. He said, "Ma'am, may I ask what you think you found?" Clara took a breath. She said, "I think I found a vault built into her dining room wall. I think there are about $6 million worth of things inside it. I think she left them to whoever bought the house, which is me. I am not sure whether to call the IRS or a lawyer or a psychiatrist, but you are a lawyer, and your father wrote her will, and I thought I would start here." Robert Devane did not say anything for a long time. Then he laughed. Not an ugly laugh. A startled laugh. A laugh of a man who had thought he had seen every kind of thing in his 30 years of practice and had just been told that he had not. He said, "Mrs. Bennett, would you like some coffee? This is going to take us a while." Clara said yes. He sent Patty out for coffee. He opened the envelope. He read the letter of provenance from his father. He read it twice. He looked up at Clara over the top of his glasses. He said, "My father told me a story once, when I was a boy. He told me he had written a letter for a lady out on Old Mill Creek Road, a lady who had come to him with a cigar box full of receipts going back 30 years and had asked him to prepare a document establishing that a collection of antiques she owned had been lawfully acquired and was fully tax-paid. I remember this because my father was amused by the story. He said the woman had kept her receipts in a cigar box, and every single one of them was in order. He said she was the most meticulous client he had ever had. He said he had been afraid to ask her what was in the collection. I always wondered. And now I know." Clara said, "Mr. Devane, is it mine? Legally, is it mine?" Robert Devane looked at her. He said, "Ma'am, the county sold you the property. The property included the house. The house included everything inside it that was not specifically excluded from the sale, and nothing was specifically excluded. Mrs. Holloway had no will because she died, as far as the state was concerned, intestate, though it appears she intended for her property to pass to whoever came next, and she took steps to ensure it. The collection is yours. There will be tax implications. You will need to declare the collection as inherited property, and the value at inheritance will be the fair market value at the date you acquired title, which was last week. There may be some questions from the state and possibly the federal government about the origins of the items, but my father's letter of provenance is a very strong document, and my firm, as the successor to my father's practice, will stand behind it. You will need a good accountant. You will probably need to sell some of the items to pay the taxes on the others. It will be complicated. But yes, Mrs. Bennett, it is yours." Clara put her hands over her face. She sat there in Robert Devane's office for a full minute with her hands over her face, and Robert Devane, who was a decent man, did not say anything. He just sat there and waited. Patty came back with the coffee and set it down and took one look at Clara and went quietly back out. When Clara lowered her hands, she was not crying. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. She was something else. She was something she had not been in a very long time, and she did not have a word for it yet. But her whole body felt loose and unfamiliar and a little weak, as if she had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just set it down. She said, "Mr. Devane, will you help me? I do not know how to do this. Any of this. I do not know how to call an appraiser in New York. I do not know how to pay taxes on something like this. I do not know how to sell a painting or a ring or a gold coin. I do not know any of it. I will need help. A lot of help." Robert Devane smiled. It was a real smile, the first one he had given her, and it was kind. He said, "Mrs. Bennett, my father liked Margaret Holloway, and I believe my father would have liked you. Yes, I will help you. Let us start at the beginning." And that was how Clara Bennett, single mother from Millbrook, Tennessee, who 3 days ago had $47 in her rent envelope, sat down in a lawyer's office in Brennerville and began the strangest, longest, and most consequential conversation of her life. They talked for 2 hours. By the time Clara walked back out onto the sidewalk in front of the coffee shop, the afternoon sun was slanting down the street, and she had a handwritten list of next steps in her pocket, and she had made the first appointment, which was a phone call that Robert Devane himself was going to make to Halverson Partners in New York City the following Monday morning, and she was going to sit in his office while he made it, because she did not yet trust her own voice to say the things that needed to be said, and she was going to need to photograph everything in the vault, which she would do with her phone over the coming weekend. And she was going to need to find somewhere secure to move some of the items, which Robert Devane had already offered his firm safe for, pending appraisal and insurance. She stood on the sidewalk with the list in her pocket, and she looked up at the sky. It was the same sky it had been 3 days ago. It was the same blue, the same few scattered clouds, the same late summer haze over the hills. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. She got into her truck. She drove home. She picked up Lily from school. She took her daughter to the dollar store, and she bought her a pair of pink sneakers that were a size too big, because Lily was growing, and she bought her a new coloring book and a pack of markers. And when Lily asked her, wide-eyed, if they could afford that, Clara said, "Honey, today we can. Tomorrow we can too. And we are going to be okay." Lily held her hand all the way out to the parking lot. That night, after Lily was in bed, Clara sat at her kitchen table. She took Margaret's letter out of her coat. She read it again, all the way through. When she got to the end, to the part where Margaret said, "Go with my love, whoever you are," Clara did cry, finally, silently, with her face in her hands. She cried for Margaret, who had lost her son and her husband and had lived alone for 35 years, and who had built a vault in her wall to protect things she never quite needed for herself, and who had left a letter for a stranger. She cried for her own father, who had died when she was 14 and had never gotten to see this, would never get to see this. She cried for Rachel, the mother she had been, the years she had spent stretched thin. And she cried a little, finally, for herself, for the woman she had been 3 days ago in a trailer kitchen, counting $47 in an envelope. Then she washed her face. She set an alarm for 6 in the morning. She looked at her phone and saw that she had 2 missed calls from her cousin Becky, probably calling to tell her again that she had lost her mind, and she silenced the phone and put it face down on the table. She went to bed. In the morning, she was going to go back to Margaret's house, and she was going to begin, very carefully, to open the boxes. Clara was at the farmhouse by 7 in the morning. She had left Lily with Mrs. Pettigrew for the day, and she had packed a small canvas bag with what she hoped were the right tools. A pair of thin cotton gloves she had bought the night before at the dollar store, because she had read on her phone that people who handled old objects wore gloves. A soft cloth, a magnifying glass that had belonged to her father and had been sitting in a drawer for 20 years. Her phone, fully charged, because she was going to photograph everything. A small notebook, in which she was going to write down whatever she took out of each box, and in what order, and where it had been sitting. And a thermos of coffee, because she had a feeling she was going to be in that dining room for a very long time. The house looked different to her this morning. Not in any way she could point to. The porch still sagged. The paint still peeled. The yard was still shoulder-high in weeds. But it looked different because she looked at it differently. 2 days ago it had been a desperate gamble, a $10 bet on a future she could not quite picture. Today it was something else. Today it was the place where Margaret Holloway had lived and died, and had written a letter to a stranger, and the stranger had turned out to be her. Today it was a house with a story, and Clara was part of the story now, whether she had meant to be or not. She unlocked the front door. She walked through the parlor and into the dining room. She pulled down the loose boards of paneling she had leaned back in place. She unlocked the steel door with both keys. She opened it. She did not take anything out at first. She just stood there and looked, in the better morning light, at what was on the shelves. Then she got down on her knees and she began. The first wooden box she took down was the one labeled coins gold. It was heavier than she had expected, heavy enough that she had to support it with both hands. She carried it to the dining room table and set it down gently. She put on her cotton gloves. She lifted the lid. Inside, arranged in rows on a bed of faded blue velvet, were gold coins. Clara had seen gold on television, on jewelry, on wedding bands. She had not seen gold like this. The coins were larger than quarters, thicker, and they had the color of gold that had not been worn down or alloyed into something cheaper. They glowed, actually, in the morning light through the broken window. She counted them. There were 32 coins in the box, arranged in 4 rows of 8. She picked one up very carefully between her gloved fingers and turned it over. On one side was a standing woman with a torch. On the other side, an eagle with its wings spread. Around the edge were the words $20 and a date, 1904. Clara had read about these coins once in an article on her phone, about how someone had found a jar of them in their grandfather's attic, and they had turned out to be worth a few $1,000s each. She held the coin in her palm and felt its weight, and she thought, very clearly, that her hand had never held so much money in one place. She put the coin back. She looked at all 32 of them, lying there on their velvet, and she closed the lid very slowly, and she carried the box back to the vault, and she set it on the shelf, and she sat down on the floor, and she breathed. Then she took down the next box. The box labeled coins. Silver was slightly larger. Inside were silver dollars, dozens of them. Some of them so old the dates were worn almost smooth. Some of them so perfectly preserved they looked as if they had been minted last week. There were Morgan dollars from the 1890s. There were peace dollars from the 1920s. There was one very old coin with a face on it Clara did not recognize, a Roman face, and a date she could not read, but which she suspected was much older than the other coins. She counted 68 coins in the box. She did not know what they were worth. Margaret's inventory book would tell her. She put the box back on the shelf. The box labeled rings and chains she opened next. Inside, lined up on soft black velvet, were 14 rings and 11 chains. The rings were of different styles. Some were thick and masculine, gold signet rings with initials carved into their faces. Some were delicate, set with small single stones. 3 of them were set with diamonds large enough that Clara understood immediately why they had been kept in a vault. One ring in particular caught her eye. It had a center stone that was deep blue, a sapphire, surrounded by a ring of diamonds, and the band was platinum and old and beautiful. Clara picked it up with her gloved fingers and held it up to the morning light, and the blue stone caught the light and held it and threw it back in a way that made Clara's breath stop. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever held. She put it back very gently. The chains were gold, most of them, delicate and heavy by turns, and 2 of them had small pendants attached to them, one a locket and one a small oval with a carved scene of a woman and a harp. Clara did not open the locket. It was not hers to look inside. She went through the other boxes more quickly, not because she was not moved by what she found, but because she knew now that if she let herself stop and truly absorb the meaning of each object, she would be in that dining room for a week. The box labeled watches contained 7 watches. 4 were pocket watches, heavy gold things with their cases engraved, lying there like small sleeping animals. 3 were wristwatches, 2 of them women's and 1 a man's, and they were the kind of watches Clara had only ever seen in advertisements in the glossy magazines at the dentist's office, watches whose brand names she had heard but had never quite understood meant actual money. She picked up one of the pocket watches, the one on top, and turned it over. On the back of the case, engraved in flowing script, were the initials E.B. V. Edwin B. Vance, Clara thought. Margaret's cousin, the man who had taught her the trade. Clara set the watch down and closed the box and sat very still for a moment, because she was thinking about a 19-year-old girl showing up at a man's office in New York City in 1950 with no money and no family. And she was thinking about the kindness of strangers, which was a thing she had not permitted herself to think about in a long time. The box labeled loose stones contained stones. That was the only word for it. Clara opened the lid, and there were compartments inside the box, small velvet-lined compartments. And in the compartments were stones. Not set in jewelry. Not finished. Just stones. Diamonds, loose and faceted, some of them small and clear, some of them larger and with a visible warmth in their color. 2 emeralds, heavy and deep green. 3 sapphires, one the same blue as the ring she had just held. 4 rubies, dark red, each the size of a pea. Maybe 2 dozen smaller stones she could not identify by color alone. They sat there in their little compartments looking up at her like a tiny galaxy. Clara closed the box almost immediately. She was not ready for the loose stones. The loose stones were not for today. The box labeled miscellaneous contained papers. Clara had been a little afraid of this box because Margaret's letter had said it contained the tax receipts, which were important, but she opened it and found the receipts stacked neatly in 3 file folders, and she found something else underneath them that she had not expected. She found a second set of photographs. Not Margaret's photographs. Photographs of the collection itself, taken in 1985, photographed object by object with a small scale in the corner of each image for size reference. Someone had done a professional job. Each photograph was labeled on the back with a corresponding number that matched the entries in Margaret's inventory book. Clara understood, looking at these, that Margaret had not simply kept a list. Margaret had kept a whole appraisal file, a working archive, the kind of thing a serious dealer kept. Margaret Holloway, the widow of Thomas Holloway the dairy farmer, had maintained the records of a professional collector for 40 years in a box in a vault in her wall. Clara sat down in one of the dining room chairs, and she smiled. She did not smile a lot, in general. She was not a smiler. She had grown up careful, and she had stayed careful, and smiles had not been a thing she had given away easily, even when she was a child. But she smiled now, a slow private smile, at a woman she had never met, for a life she was only just beginning to understand. Margaret had been, she thought, one of the most secretly formidable women in the history of Millbrook County, and nobody had known it, and Margaret had liked it that way. Clara stood up. She had 3 bundles left to open, the linen-wrapped ones on the bottom shelf. She unwrapped the smallest first. It was a book. Not one of the books from the top shelf, a different book, wrapped separately for reasons that became clear as Clara unfolded the last fold of the linen. It was a very old book. The cover was wooden, bound in cracked leather, and the pages, when Clara opened it with infinite care, were not paper. They were vellum. She did not know much about old books, but she. Long pause at the other end of the line. Then Rebecca Halverson said, "Mr. Devane, would you excuse me one moment?" They heard her set the phone down. They heard her walk across a floor. They heard her walk back. They heard her pick the phone up again. She said, "I am sorry. I needed to check something in our archive. Margaret Holloway, formerly Margaret Vance. Yes, my grandfather Leonard bought pieces from Edwin Vance for many years, and when Edwin passed, he continued to buy from the executor of the estate, who was Margaret, for a number of years after that. My father Peter remembered Margaret. He used to speak of her. He said she was the most intelligent he had ever worked with who had never had formal training. Mr. Devane, Mrs. Bennett, am I understanding you correctly? Mrs. Holloway has passed, and her collection has come into Mrs. Bennett's ownership." Clara said, "Yes, ma'am." Rebecca Halverson said, "How large is the inventory, Mrs. Bennett?" Clara looked at Robert Devane. Robert Devane nodded at her. Clara said, "The inventory book has approximately 90 entries. The appraised value in 1985 was just over $2 million. I have photographs of every item. I have the inventory book. I have a letter of provenance drawn up by Mr. Devane's father in 1990 that has the receipts and the tax documentation. I do not know what anything is worth today. That is why I am calling you." There was another long pause. Then Rebecca Halverson said, "Mrs. Bennett, I would like to come and see the collection, if that is acceptable to you. I can be in Nashville on Thursday. I can drive to your location Friday morning. I will bring a colleague with me, a specialist in historical manuscripts, and I will bring a portable assessment kit. We will not take anything with us on this first visit. We will simply document and make preliminary assessments, and then we will discuss with you how you would like to proceed, whether you would like to consign items to us for sale, or have them appraised for insurance purposes, or have them authenticated for your own records. Is this acceptable?" Clara said, "Yes, ma'am." Rebecca Halverson said, "Mrs. Bennett, I want to say one more thing, because you sound young, and I do not know your situation. We have a standing policy with clients who are new to this world. We do not take retainers. We do not charge for initial assessments. Our fee structure is a percentage of final sale or a flat fee for appraisals only, and we will explain everything to you before you sign anything. My family has been doing this for 3 generations, and we did not stay in business for 3 generations by taking advantage of people who had just inherited their grandmother's jewelry. You will not be rushed. You will not be pressured. If we cannot help you in a way that is fair, we will tell you, and we will recommend someone who can. Do you understand, Mrs. Bennett? Clara said, Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Rebecca said, We will see you Friday. They hung up. Robert Devane looked at Clara. Clara looked at Robert Devane. Robert Devane said, Well, Mrs. Bennett, I think you just bought yourself a very good morning. Rebecca Halverson arrived at Clara's farmhouse at 10 o'clock on Friday morning in a rental car, accompanied by a thin gray-haired man in a tweed jacket whom she introduced as Dr. Aaron Mindel, a specialist in medieval and early modern manuscripts at a university Clara had heard of but had never thought would send one of its people to Old Mill Creek Road. Rebecca herself was a tall woman in her 50s, sharp-eyed, dressed in a simple dark jacket and trousers, carrying a small rigid case the size of a briefcase. She shook Clara's hand. She did not look at the collapsing porch or the yard full of weeds or the broken window. She looked at Clara, and she smiled, and she said, Mrs. Bennett, thank you for having us. Shall we go inside? Clara took them to the dining room. She opened the steel door. She stood back. Rebecca Halverson looked into the vault. Dr. Mindel looked into the vault. They did not say anything for what felt to Clara like a very long time. Rebecca took a pair of white cotton gloves out of her case and put them on. Dr. Mindel did the same. Rebecca said, Mrs. Bennett, may I? Clara said, yes. Rebecca reached in and lifted down the first wooden box. Clara had photographed and labeled each box before she had closed the vault the Monday before, so Rebecca could find what she wanted. Rebecca opened it. She looked inside. She did not speak. She closed it and set it on the dining room table. She took down the next box. And the next. She moved through the shelves with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been doing this work for a very long time. Dr. Mindel reached for the linen bundles on the bottom shelf. He unwrapped the small one first. The one Clara had suspected was a medieval manuscript, and when he saw what was inside, the thin gray-haired man made a small sound in the back of his throat that Clara had not heard a person make outside of church. He said, very quietly too, knew enough from reading on her phone over the past 2 nights to recognize that this was something made before paper was common, something from a time she could not quite place, and the pages were illuminated in gold leaf and blue and red ink, with decorated capital letters and careful Latin script. Clara did not turn many of the pages. She was afraid. She looked at 3 pages only, and then she wrapped the book back up, exactly as she had found it, and she wrote in her notebook, small book, vellum pages, possibly medieval, unopened, and she set it aside. That book, she thought, was going to need a specialist. That book was not for amateur hands. The second bundle was flatter and larger. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a painting, a small oil painting, unframed, about the size of a sheet of notebook paper, depicting a woman in a white cap sewing in the light of a window. The colors were dark and warm, and the brushwork was so fine that Clara felt, looking at the woman, as if the woman were about to look up. Clara did not know the painter. She did not recognize the signature in the lower right corner, a small scrawled set of initials she could barely make out. But she knew, looking at it, that it was beautiful in a way that most things are not beautiful. It was beautiful the way the stained glass in the old Methodist church in Millbrook was beautiful, the way the light on the mountain was beautiful in October. She wrapped it back up. She wrote in her notebook, small oil painting, woman sewing, 17th century style, and she set it on the table beside the book. The third bundle was the largest. Clara knelt down and lifted it carefully out of the vault. It was heavy. She laid it on the dining room table and unwrapped it slowly. Inside the linen were the candlesticks. A pair of silver candlesticks, about a foot tall each, heavy in her hand, with a soft sheen on them that age had given them, covered in an intricate pattern of vines and small figures that Clara could not quite make out in the morning light. She picked one up and turned it over. On the bottom, stamped into the silver, were marks she did not recognize. A lion, a crown, a letter. a name in tiny script. Clara did not know what any of these meant, but she wrote them all down in her notebook, carefully, copying each mark as best she could. She set the candlesticks beside the painting and the book. She looked at her watch. It was past noon. She had been in the dining room for 5 hours. She wrapped everything back up, exactly as she had found it. She put everything back in the vault, exactly where it had been. She closed the steel door. She locked it with both keys. She put the loose boards of paneling back in place. She cleaned up her wrappings and her notebook and her phone and her father's magnifying glass, and she put them in her bag. She took one last look around the dining room, as if to thank the room for holding what it had held for so long, and then she walked out. She stood on the porch in the full noon sun, and she called Robert Devane's office on her phone. Patty picked up. Clara said, "Patty, this is Clara Bennett. Can you tell Mr. Devane I have finished the inventory, and I have photographs of everything, and I am ready for him to call New York on Monday?" Patty said she would tell him. Clara said thank you. She hung up. She drove home. Monday morning, Clara was sitting in Robert Devane's office at 9:30. She had dropped Lily at school and had driven straight to Brennerville, and she was wearing the nicest clothes she owned, which were a pair of dark slacks and a blouse she had bought for a job interview 2 years ago that she had not gotten. Patty brought her coffee. Robert Devane sat behind his desk and looked at Clara and said, "Are you ready, Mrs. Bennett?" Clara said, "No, but do it anyway." He laughed, and then he dialed the number for Halverson Partners in New York City, and he put the phone on speaker. A woman's voice answered. Crisp. Professional. "Halverson Partners, how may I direct your call?" Robert Devane said, "This is Robert Devane. I am an attorney in Brennerville, Tennessee, and I am calling on behalf of a client who has an inherited collection that will require appraisal. I would like to speak with Rebecca Halverson directly, if she is available, or to make an appointment to speak with her at her earliest convenience." The woman said, "One moment, please." There was a pause, a longer pause than Clara had expected. Then a different voice came on. A woman's voice, warmer, middle-aged. "This is Rebecca Halverson." Robert Devane introduced himself again. He introduced Clara. He explained, in a careful, measured way, that Clara had recently acquired a property in Tennessee, and that the property had contained a collection of items that appeared to have been assembled over decades by the previous owner, and that the previous owner had left behind an inventory book from 1985 listing the items and their appraisals as of that date, and that the inventory book had been kept by a woman named Margaret Holloway. There was a very Rebecca, more to himself, "My God." He said to Clara, "Mrs. Bennett, may I ask, where was this book?" Clara pointed at the bottom shelf. Dr. Mendel said, "For how long?" Clara said, "I do not know for certain. Margaret hid it before 1985, probably much earlier." Dr. Mendel sat down in one of the dining room chairs. He held the small book in his gloved hands, as if it were a sleeping bird. He said, "Mrs. Bennett, I need to look at this under better light. I need to photograph it. I need to examine it very carefully. May I use a table outside in the sun?" Clara said, "Yes, of course." They worked for 4 hours. Rebecca went through the boxes one by one. She used a small loupe. She examined the gold coins individually. She examined the silver coins. She examined every ring and chain in the box, and every watch, and every loose stone. She opened the box of miscellaneous papers, and she read Mr. Devane's letter of provenance, the tax receipts, the appraisal file. She took photographs. She wrote in a small leather notebook she had brought. She drank a cup of coffee Clara made for her. She did not speak much. She was concentrating. Dr. Mendel, outside on a card table Clara had dragged from the kitchen, photographed the manuscript page by page with a special rig he had brought, using a light that was supposed to be gentle on old paper. Then he sat with the oil painting, and then with the candlesticks, and then with the books from the top shelf of the vault, which Clara had almost forgotten about in the excitement of the boxes. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Rebecca and Dr. Mendel came and sat down with Clara on the porch. Clara had brought out 3 glasses of iced tea. They sat on the porch steps together, the lawyer's clients, and drank their tea, and Rebecca spoke first. She said, "Mrs. Bennett, I am going to tell you some things in plain language, and I want you to ask me any questions you need to ask. Is that all right?" Clara said yes. Rebecca said, "Your collection is genuine. Every piece in the boxes is what the inventory says it is. Margaret Holloway kept flawless records. The provenance file is more complete than 99% of what I see in estate work. The 1985 appraisals are accurate for that year, and most of the items have appreciated significantly since then because the market for fine antique jewelry, rare coins, and historical pieces has been strong for decades. I will not give you precise numbers today because precision requires more work than I can do on a porch, but I can give you ranges. Clara set her iced tea down because her hands were starting to shake. Rebecca said, the gold coins, as a group, are likely worth between $250,000 and $300,000 at current market. The silver coins, closer to $80,000. The rings, collectively, between $400,000 and $500,000, with the sapphire ring alone likely fetching $150,000 at auction. The watches, the 4 pocket watches in particular, probably $700,000 in total, possibly more, depending on condition certification from the manufacturers. The loose stones, hard to say until they are graded, but given what I saw, probably $400,000. The candlesticks are by Paul de Lamery, which is a name you do not need to know the meaning of, but they are almost certainly worth $150,000 for the pair. The painting is a 17th-century Dutch interior in the style of Gabriel Metsu, and it will need attribution work, but even as an unattributed piece from the period, it is probably $120,000, and if we can establish attribution to a known painter, that number could triple. The books on the top shelf of your vault, taken together, are worth probably $200,000, depending on which editions they are, and Dr. Mindel has been looking at them. Rebecca stopped. She picked up her iced tea. She took a sip. She said, Mrs. Bennett, that leaves the manuscript. Dr. Mindel cleared his throat. He leaned forward, holding his glass of tea in both hands. He said, Mrs. Bennett, I need to do more work before I say anything definitive, and I want you to understand that the numbers I am about to give you are preliminary. Do you understand? Clara said yes. Dr. Mindel said, your manuscript is a 15th-century book of hours. It was produced, based on the style of the illumination and the script, in Flanders, probably in the region of Bruges, between about 1460 and 1480. It is in extraordinary condition. The gold leaf is intact. The pigments are stable. Most of the miniatures have not been cut out, which is rare, because in the 19th century many manuscripts of this quality had their illuminated pages removed and sold separately. Yours is mostly whole. I have photographed it, and I will examine the photographs at length when I return to the university. But my initial reading is that this manuscript was produced in a particular workshop that I believe I can identify. If I am correct, and if we can establish the provenance, the manuscript by itself is likely worth between $800,000 and $1.5 million, depending on how it is sold and to whom. Clara did not say anything. Rebecca said, Mrs. Bennett, the total value of your collection, based on our very rough preliminary assessment today, is somewhere between $3 million and $4.5 million. It could be higher, depending on the manuscript and the painting. It is unlikely to be lower. I want you to take some time before you make any decisions. I want you to think about what you need and what you want and what Mrs. Holloway might have wanted. We will leave today. We will send you a written preliminary assessment next week. We will recommend pieces that we think should be sold first, pieces that might be held, pieces that might be donated for tax advantages. We will recommend specific auction houses and private buyers for different kinds of pieces. And we will give you time. There is no rush. Nothing in that vault is going to depreciate. Some of it may appreciate significantly in the coming years. You have time, Mrs. Bennett. You do not have to decide anything today, or this week, or this month. Clara put her hands over her face. She did not cry. She was beyond crying, she thought. She just sat there with her hands over her face and let what she had heard settle through her chest, and her arms and her hands and her legs. $3 to $4.5 million. Margaret Holloway had left her $3 to $4.5 million. No, that was not right. Margaret had left it to whoever walked into her house and tore down her wall and had the good sense and the hunger and the desperation to keep walking toward the thing she had left behind. Margaret had left it to someone who needed it, and someone who had needed it had been Clara. She lowered her hands. She said, to Rebecca, to Dr. Mindel, to the porch, to the yard, to the house behind her, to Margaret, she said, thank you. She drove home that evening in a state that was not quite shock and not quite happiness and not quite anything with a name. Lily was at Mrs. Pettigrew's. Clara stopped by to pick her up, and Mrs. Pettigrew, who had known something was going on because Clara had been acting strangely for a week and a half, looked at Clara's face when she walked in the door and said, "Honey, sit down. I will make you some tea." Clara sat down. Mrs. Pettigrew made her tea. Clara told Mrs. Pettigrew some of it. Not all of it. She did not say the numbers. She said only that the house had contained some things that had belonged to Margaret Holloway, and that those things were going to change Clara and Lily's life, and that Clara was going to need some help, and that Mrs. Pettigrew was one of the first people she was going to ask. Mrs. Pettigrew, who had been a postal worker for 40 years and had seen a great deal of human weather, did not ask for details. She just reached across the table and patted Clara's hand and said, "Honey, I am glad. That is all. I am just glad." Clara took Lily home. She fed Lily dinner. She helped Lily with her homework. She listened to Lily tell her about a girl at school named Brianna who had said Lily's shoes looked funny, and she listened to Lily tell her that she had told Brianna her shoes were brand new from the dollar store, and that was the only answer Brianna deserved, and Clara had laughed out loud for the first time in what felt like a year. After Lily was in bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table. She called Earl Vickers. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Mr. Vickers, this is Clara Bennett. From the Holloway place. Do you have a little time?" Earl said, "I do." Clara told him. She told him all of it. She told him about the wall and the vault and the letter and the inventory and the Halverson family and the woman named Rebecca and the man named Dr. Mendel and the Book of Hours from Bruges and the candlesticks by Paul de Lamery and the Dutch painting and everything Margaret had left behind. She told him who Margaret had been. Not all of it. She did not tell him what Margaret had asked her not to tell. But she told him enough. She told him Margaret had been a working woman in New York City in the 1950s, and she had been an expert in her field, and she had loved Thomas Holloway and Daniel Holloway with her whole heart, and she had kept her past to herself because she had wanted to, because she had earned the right to, because what had come before had been hers alone to carry. Earl listened without interrupting. When Clara was finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then Earl Vickers said, very quietly, "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for respecting her. I always knew she was something more than what she showed. I just never had the right words for it." Clara said, "Mr. Vickers, there is one more thing." Earl said, "Yes." Clara said, "Margaret's son Daniel. Her husband Thomas. They are buried in the Millbrook Cemetery. I drove by there once. I am going to pay to have their headstones cleaned and restored. And I am going to pay for a proper headstone for Margaret, next to theirs. A good one. In marble. With her full name and her dates, and a line of her own, choosing from the letter she left me. And I would like you to come with me when I have it set. I think she would want somebody there who loved her." There was a pause on the line. Then Earl said, in a voice that had changed, "I would be honored, Mrs. Bennett." Clara said, "Call me Clara." He said, "Clara." "I would be honored, Clara." They said goodnight. The news of Clara Bennett began to spread through Millbrook County approximately 2 days after that. Clara had not told anyone except Mrs. Pettigrew, Earl Vickers, Robert Devane, and Rebecca Halverson. But a truck had come up Old Mill Creek Road on Friday with 2 strangers in it, a tall woman and a thin gray-haired man, and someone had seen them, and someone had mentioned it, and by Monday morning, the diner in Millbrook was talking about it, and by Tuesday afternoon, the gas station was talking about it, and by Wednesday, Clara's phone was ringing. Her cousin Becky called first. Becky said, "Clara, I heard some things, and I am calling to find out what is true." Clara said, "What have you heard?" Becky said, "I have heard there were people from New York at your house on Friday. I have heard that Hal Osterman at the county has been asked by the state revenue people to pull the records on your property. I have heard that you have been driving a new car, which I know you have not been, but it is being said. I have heard that you have come into some money. Clara, what is going on?" Clara sat at her kitchen table, and she held the phone to her ear, and she thought about what to say to the cousin who had called her aunt the night of Clara's purchase to say that Clara had lost her mind. She said, "Becky, the house has some things in it that belong to the woman who lived there. The things are valuable. I am working with a law firm and an appraisal firm to handle them properly. I am not going to discuss the specifics on the phone because I have been advised not to. When I am ready to discuss it, I will. In the meantime, I would appreciate it if the family did not gossip about me in ways that could hurt Lily. That is all I am going to say." There was a long silence on the line. Then Becky said, "Clara, I was not gossiping. I was worried about you." Clara said, "Becky, You called Aunt Doreen the night I bought that house, and you told her I had lost my mind. You were not worried. You were entertained. I am going to remember that. I am not going to hold it against you forever, because we are family, but I am going to remember it. Good night, Becky." She hung up. She did not hang up on her cousin Becky out of anger. She hung up because she had decided, at some point over the past week, in the quiet of her kitchen and the light of the flashlight in the vault, that she was done being the person other people laughed at. She was not going to be ugly about it. She was not going to make a scene. But she was not going to pretend either. She was 34 years old, and she had a daughter, and she had been handed a life by a woman who had believed that whoever came through that wall deserved it, and she was not going to spend that life apologizing to people who had laughed at her when she was poor. The next person who called was Tanya from the gas station. Clara had been wondering when Tanya would call. Tanya did not call to apologize. Tanya called to ask if Clara might be hiring any help around the place, because her hours at the gas station had been cut, and she was looking for work. Clara listened to Tanya's nervous voice, and she did not enjoy it, the way some people might have enjoyed it, because there was no pleasure in it for Clara, only a small sad understanding that Tanya was a woman who had made her own bed a long time ago, and would probably keep making it. Clara said, "Tanya, I am not hiring right now. When I am, I will think about it." Tanya stammered something about how she had not meant what she had said at the gas station that morning, and Clara said, "Tanya, you meant it. But it is all right. I have to go." She hung up. Doyle, the drunk roofer from the trailer next door, never said anything to her about it. But he did not laugh at her anymore. He looked away when she walked past. Mrs. Corbin, the daycare woman across the lot, brought Clara a plate of cookies one afternoon and said, "Clara, I want you to know I never meant anything cruel when I said what I said about you in that house. I say a lot of things I should not say. I hope you can forgive me." Clara took the cookies. She said, "Mrs. Corbin, thank you. There is nothing to forgive. I know you did not mean it." Mrs. Corbin's eyes were wet. She said, "You are a good girl, Clara. Your mama would be so proud of you." Clara said, "Thank you, Mrs. Corbin." And she did not tell Mrs. Corbin that she was going to be moving out of the trailer park within 6 months, because it did not seem kind. Within 3 months, Rebecca Halverson had begun selling pieces on Clara's behalf. They started with the silver coins and a selection of the smaller gold coins, because those were liquid and uncontroversial and Clara needed cash. The silver coins brought in $92,000 net of commission. The first batch of gold coins brought in $110,000. The first of the pocket watches, the one with EVV on the back that had belonged to Edwin Vance himself, went to a private collector for $240,000. Clara received Rebecca's checks and deposited them, and watched the numbers in her checking account grow in a way she had spent her whole life believing was impossible for people like her. She did not spend it wildly. She had never been a wild spender. She made a list on a piece of notebook paper the first week, in pencil, and she stuck to it. She paid off the 3 credit cards she had been carrying, which totaled $11,000. She paid the 9 months of back rent she had accumulated at the trailer park for $1,000, even though she did not legally owe it, because her landlord was an old man and he had not raised her rent in the last year, and she thought he deserved to be paid. She gave her mother's church, which had buried her mother 6 years ago on a payment plan that Clara had finished paying only last winter, $10,000, anonymously, through Robert Devane, because her mother had loved that church and Clara's mother had loved her. She gave Mrs. Pettigrew, who had watched Lily so many afternoons in exchange for leftover food, $5,000 and a new washer and dryer, because Mrs. Pettigrew's were from the 1990s and squealed like dying animals. She paid for Lily's entire school year's worth of lunches, plus the lunches of every other child in Lily's second-grade class whose account was showing a negative balance, because Clara had been a child with a negative lunch account once, and she knew how it felt to stand in line and know you were about to be told that you could not have the sandwich. She gave Earl Vickers a check for $15,000 with a note that said, "Mr. Vickers, I know you said you did not want anything, but Margaret would have wanted you to have something. Use it to take a trip you have been wanting to take. Or do not cash the check if you do not want to. But I am writing it because I am allowed to, and because you were her friend." Earl Vickers cashed the check, she heard later, and used it to take a trip to Ireland he had been putting off for 30 years because his wife had died before they could go. He sent Clara a postcard from Galway. She restored the Holloway graves. Thomas and Daniel got their stones cleaned and straightened. Margaret got a new stone of white marble beside them, and on it, below her name and her dates, was a single line from her letter that Clara had chosen with Earl over a cup of coffee. She kept her own counsel and loved her own people and lived her own life. The day they set the stone, it was October, and the leaves in the cemetery were turning, and Earl stood with his cap in his hands and Clara stood with Lily's hand in hers, and the man who had set the stone backed away quietly to give them space. They did not speak for a while. Then Earl said, quietly, she would have been pleased. She would have pretended she was not pleased, but she would have been pleased. Clara said, I know, Earl. I know. And Lily, who had asked to come, who had wanted to meet the lady whose house had made everything different, laid a handful of wildflowers she had picked from the yard on the new grass in front of Margaret's stone. She said, very seriously, to the stone, thank you for the house. Mama and I are going to take care of it. Clara's eyes burned. She put her hand on her daughter's head. She said, yes, we are, Lily. We are going to take care of it. By the following spring, the renovation of the farmhouse was complete. Clara had hired a contractor from Brennerville, a decent man named Winston Briggs who had done historical restoration before, who had fallen in love with the farmhouse the first day he walked through it. He had stripped the old roof and replaced it with new cedar shingles. He had taken the rotten front porch apart and rebuilt it with the same design, the same slight curve around the corner. He had replaced every window in the house with new double-pane windows that looked like the old ones, but worked better. He had torn out the collapsed back porch and rebuilt it. He had replaced the rotten floorboards in the kitchen and had polished the good floorboards in the rest of the house. He had restored the old clawfoot tub upstairs. He had kept the wallpaper in the parlor cleaned and stabilized, because Clara had asked him to. He had not touched the dining room wall. The vault was still there, locked behind the paneling, which had been repaired and put back exactly as Margaret had left it, because Clara had decided that some things should stay exactly as they had been, even if they were empty now. On the day Clara and Lily moved in, Lily walked through each room with her small mouth slightly open and her eyes enormous. Her bedroom, upstairs, had been painted pale yellow at her request. There was a new bed with a white frame. There was a bookshelf already filled with the books Clara had been slowly buying for her at yard sales and in the children's section of the thrift store over the past 6 months. There was a window with a view of the old apple tree in the clearing out back. Lily stood in the middle of her room and turned in a slow circle and said, Mama, is this really mine? Clara said, it is really yours, baby. Nobody can take this room from you. This is your room. This is your house. Lily sat down on the edge of the bed and she cried, which Lily almost never did, and Clara sat down beside her and held her and did not say anything. They sat there for a long time. Clara's own bedroom was Margaret's old room, which Clara had painted a pale blue and had furnished with new things, though she had kept Margaret's double bed and had put a new mattress on it. She had kept the quilt too, and the photographs, and the little box of Thomas's love letters, which were still under the bed where Margaret had left them, because Clara had decided that some things were not hers to throw away even if she had technically inherited them. The first night in the farmhouse, after Lily was asleep, Clara went downstairs and sat on the new front porch and watched the moon rise over the pines. The new porch boards were solid under her feet. The new porch light glowed warm and steady above her head. The yard had been cleared and reseeded, and the grass was just starting to come in. In the clearing behind the house, a raised bed for a new vegetable garden had been built, the soil turned and amended, and Clara planned to put tomatoes and beans and squash in it the following week. Down the path, the well house had been repaired, and the well had been tested and was clean. Down the other path, the spring still flowed. She sat on the porch and she thought about everything that had happened, and she thought about the woman she had been 8 months ago on the concrete stoop of a trailer, counting bills in an envelope, staring into a kind of dark she had begun to believe would never lift. She thought about the $10 listing on the county classifieds, the laptop screen in the pre-dawn kitchen, the decision that had not felt like a decision. She thought about how close she had come to scrolling past it. She had almost scrolled past it. She had not expected anything. She had been looking because she was in the habit of looking. If she had been a little more tired that night, if Lily had stirred in the next room, if the battery on her laptop had died a minute sooner, she would have missed it. Some other person would have bought the Holloway place for $10, or no one would have bought it, and the county would have bulldozed it eventually, and the wall would have come down with the rest, and Margaret's letter and Margaret's vault and Margaret's life's work would have ended up in a landfill somewhere. Clara did not know what to make of that. She did not believe in fate, exactly. She did not believe in miracles. But she believed, sitting on the porch that night, that sometimes the world left doors open, and that the doors closed eventually, and that the difference between a life and another life was often just the question of whether a tired person walked through a door while it was still open. She had walked through. She thought about Lily asleep upstairs in a yellow room. She thought about the college account Robert Devane had set up in Lily's name, already holding $200,000, with more to come as more pieces sold. She thought about the community scholarship fund Clara had started at Millbrook High School in Margaret's name to help girls from low-income families pay for their first year of college. She thought about the small grant she had given to the Millbrook Food Bank to replace their broken refrigerator. She thought about the piece of land she had bought next door, 40 more acres, to keep anyone from building close to the farmhouse, because the quiet was part of what Margaret had loved and Clara loved it too now. She thought about Rebecca Halverson, who called every few weeks with updates and had become something like a friend. She thought about Dr. Mendel, who had authenticated the Book of Hours to its original workshop in Bruges, and had helped place it with a museum rather than with a private buyer, because Clara had decided that a manuscript like that should not sit in another vault in another wall for another 40 years. The museum had paid $1.3 million, and the book was now on display, with a plaque that said, "Gift of the Holloway Collection, Millbrook, Tennessee." She thought about Margaret, who had wanted her things to flower into something good in another woman's better life. Clara closed her eyes on the porch, and she said, very quietly, into the dark, "Margaret, I hope this is what you meant. I hope it is." A wind moved through the pines. The house behind her, the good solid, restored house, settled on its foundation with a small sound that was almost like a sigh. She sat there a long time. When she finally went inside, she turned out the porch light and locked the front door with the brass key on its faded red ribbon, which she had kept, even though the locks had been changed. She climbed the stairs. She looked in on Lily, who was asleep on her side with her cheek on her hand, and she stood in the doorway of her daughter's room and watched her breathe, just like she had watched her breathe in the trailer 8 months ago, when $47 in an envelope had been the only thing between them and homelessness. Lily's breathing was the same. Clara closed the door softly. She went to her own bedroom. She undressed. She put on the nightgown she had bought herself, a good cotton one, because she had decided that a woman should sleep in a nightgown that did not come from the clearance bin. She got into bed. She lay there in the dark and listened to the house and the wind. She thought, one more thing, before she slept. She thought about the letter Margaret had written, the part about the large things in your life, the people you love. She thought about Lily. She thought about Mrs. Pettigrew and Earl Vickers and Robert Devane and the girls at the high school who would someday go to college on the Margaret Holloway scholarship. She thought about the community of Millbrook, which had laughed at her and then, to her surprise, had mostly not known how to look her in the eye, and which had begun, slowly, to come around. She thought about her mother, who had died before any of this, but who had taught her never to give up on looking, even when the looking had stopped feeling like hope. She fell asleep. In the morning, she would wake in the blue room that had been Margaret's. She would make coffee in the restored kitchen. She would pack Lily's lunch in a new lunchbox that had cartoon animals on it. She would drive her daughter to school in a paid-off used car, because Clara still did not see the need for a new one. She would come back to the farmhouse, and she would work in the garden, and she would answer emails from the law firm and the appraisal firm, and she would eat a sandwich at noon on the porch she had rebuilt, and in the afternoon she would walk down the path to the spring, and she would stand there and listen to the water, and she would think about a woman named Margaret, and she would think about a girl named Lily, and she would think about the quiet miracle of a house that had been sold for $10 to a woman who had needed it more than the world had known. And all of that, every ordinary piece of it, would be hers. It would be hers in the way that a life is a person's own. Hard-won, improbable, stitched together from accidents and choices and the generosity of a stranger who had reached across decades to touch the hand of someone she would never meet. It would not be a life without sorrow, because no life is. Lily would grow up. Clara would grow older. Some of the things they loved now would fade or change. But the bones of it, the land and the house and the quiet and each other, those would hold. They would hold for a long, long time. Clara Bennett slept. And outside her window, under the moon that rose over the pines, the farmhouse that had once cost $10 sat firm on its foundation, its windows dark, its roof whole, its porch straight, holding inside it a mother and a daughter, and the patient still held secret of a vault that had done what it had been built to do. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.